Welcome back to episode 2 of SIDEOUT with VNS. We're talking to Michelle Wood Dan Ota and continuing our conversation from episode 1. In part 2 of our conversation, we'll hear their thoughts on coaching philosophy, seasonal planning, practice planning, and drill planning.
We're kind of sliding into some coaching philosophy talks, which is philosophy. When someone first asked me this, I remember philosophy sounded like a terrifying word. I'm like, I'm not a philosopher. Like, my God, I don't know what that means. I don't know what I want to say. And still to this day, I never seem to have a very succinct answer for this question. I tend to ramble. So, what are your guys' thoughts on having a coaching philosophy? What do you think it's important? Do you think it's something that coaches should be considering? And maybe how that evolves. Michelle, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, you're right. It's a scary word. And for some reason, we're all intimidated by it because it's like there is a right or wrong answer. It's like, sorry, where am I supposed to, how many coaches have Googled what is a coaching philosophy or examples of a coaching philosophy, and they're trying to find something to steal. But the reality is that I do think it's important. I do think it's something that should guide you and guide your decisions. And I don't think it has to be something that is volleyball specific. I think it does evolve. I don't think it has to be something that stays stationary the entire time, because the reality is we as people evolve, and the types of athletes that we're coaching, they evolve as well. So I think it's important. I think it helps guide you. And for me, it's often based on my values and how I'm going to shape my decisions.
Yeah. Dan, thoughts on a coaching philosophy?
Well, I think your actions basically are a reflection of your coaching philosophy. So people, like coaches, probably, if they are scared about thinking about it, they just don't understand that they're already embodying their coaching philosophy or their values. Maybe there's a bit of a distinction between the two, but I think there needs to be some deliberate reflection on what is important to you, because those things are probably reflected in your actions and your words every day, every time you're on the court with athletes, and having that clear in your mind, and then making sure that your actions follow from that, and then being able to articulate that clearly to your athletes is extremely important.
Yeah, I think I agree. So I'm hearing values. I'm hearing like a correlation between your beliefs and your actions, and I think that's where coaches can find themselves in a sticky situation sometimes, is when what they say and what they do doesn't necessarily match, and that can create some confusion or potentially even some conflict within teams. If you were gonna tell me today on May 14th what your coaching philosophy is or what it embodies, how does that sound today? And I'm sure I could ask you in a year from now, and maybe, like you said, Michelle, that's evolved. But today, Michelle, what's your coaching philosophy?
Yeah, I base it off of a people first mentality. Like at the end of the day, I'm working with student athletes, and if I want them to thrive and succeed, I need to think of them as human beings first before I can get the athlete to be successful. And then I have to remember that I'm here to maximize passions, and that includes my own. And one of the reasons I went into coaching at the same time as I was hired at Acadia University, I was also hired within the Toronto District School Board. And that took some time to get into that pathway, and I had to make a decision. And I thought, people aren't always passionate about education or studying things in school, but when people make the decision to pursue a sport, chances are they're really passionate about it. So it's my responsibility to make sure I'm maximizing that passion. So when I'm looking at things that I value, it's work ethic and it's attention to detail. Those two things will formulate every decision or what I'm trying to accomplish based on whether or not, the work ethic is there, and whether or not they're focusing on the process through that attention to detail. Which, if we look at how does my coaching philosophy evolve? Well, right now I'm kind of looking at, we're in a generation where patience and instant gratification is something that our student athletes are struggling with. They want the answer now. They want the result now. They don't want to be a part of this process. So how do I involve that now in my coaching philosophy and some of my decisions moving forward?
Yeah, thanks. Dan, what's your current coaching philosophy in 2020?
I don't think it's changed that much. Maybe the way I articulate it might have changed. But I think to kind of reiterate Michelle's point about work ethic, I think that's always been a fairly simple formula. The problem is that I don't think most people, and by people I also include athletes, really understand how hard you got to work. And this is often the thing that separates average to from like the really good, or the really good to the best, is how hard you really have to work. And I think even if you realize it at some point, you're not willing to go there. It's just too hard. And this is what separates, the Michael Jordans and the Kobe Bryants from, the rest of the people that are trying to do what they do, or think that they're doing what they do. I would say excellence. To me, time is finite. So if you're going to spend time doing something, like you might as well do it well, and do it really well, if you want to be really good at it. So I hate it when we waste time. I say this to my team all the time, or hopefully not all the time, but whenever I feel like we're wasting each other's time, it's like, if we're not here, we're not committed to doing this, and look like we're committed to each other, then we're just wasting everyone's time, and we should probably just go home and find something else to do with our time. So to me, that's extremely important. And I think something that I probably articulate differently now, and I certainly say this to players a lot now, is really understanding that what defines us in our setting is kind of our ability to make people around us better. So I think as it pertains to a coaching philosophy, I try to teach that, but I also feel like I play a huge role in that. I don't coach because it's a financially lucrative career. I don't coach because I get all these plaques, and go on the occasional podcast or whatever like this. No, I coach because I feel like I'm making a fairly important impact in an important part of a lot of these people's lives. And sometimes I get it wrong. I don't do a very good job at it. And then sometimes I get it right, and hopefully I get it right more often than not. But I think that's the most rewarding part of the job for me, is when I reconnect with some of our grads 5-6 years down the road and see what they've done. And most of the time it's really impressive. And if I feel like I've had even just a little bit to do with that, then I feel like that's something that I take a lot of pride in, and something that if I'm going to do it, I want to do it really well. So yeah, I think those are probably the three most important elements of my own coaching philosophy.
Yeah, I think from what both of you guys are saying, it reminds me of a quote that I saw, and I'm not going to remember it exactly right, but I'll get the gist of it, in the Last Dance, and they were talking about Michael Jordan and his extraordinary work ethic, and the quote went something like, he was tough and he was demanding, but he would never ask something of me that he wouldn't do himself. And something to that effect. And that sounds like that's a core element through both of your coaching philosophies, that if you're asking for work ethic, you're asking for excellence, then that's something that you both are putting forward in your behaviors as well, so that your athletes aren't saying, well, I'm working hard, but you're doing half, or you're doing less than. So being exemplar, and being modeling that in your behaviors, as we mentioned, and staying consistent with your message, what you do and what you say, seems to be a common thread for both of you.
Yeah, and there's so many examples of this kind of mindset in books. Sweep the sheds, or there's a book. It's Chop the Wood, Carry the Water, and in the book, the guy is trying to become a samurai, and he doesn't understand why he's having to chop the wood, carry the water, and he's having to really embody all the work ethic and buy into the vision. And he's told to build this house, and he's half-assing it and doing all sorts of different things to build this house, and doesn't realize at the end that the house he's building is something that he has to live in. And so just this mindset that you really do need to pull your weight, and you need to work hard, not because of what the end result might be, but because you're valuing what you're doing in this moment, and you're benefiting from the experience right now.
Yeah. And I think, again, just kind of I'm going to summarize what you guys said in terms of coaches who are either starting or trying to formulate, what could this coaching philosophy look like, and just so kind of looking within themselves, looking at their own values, what they believe is important, and then being able to model that through their behavior and based on who's in front of them. Would that be a very, very in a nutshell synopsis of kind of some of the things you guys mentioned?
I would argue too, like maybe start backwards, in a sense of like, what do I do currently? And what does that kind of imply about my own coaching philosophy? And if you don't like where that conclusion kind of leads you, then it's okay. So I need to reinvent that and then make sure my actions follow from that, and my regular activity is reflective and consistent with what I want that philosophy to be.
Yeah, sounds like lots of inward reflection and looking at yourself is a big part of that.
Lots of time.
Is a big part.
Now's the time. Yeah. Now is the time.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, before we talk about planning, just my 2 cents on the coaching philosophies. I find like a lot of a commonality I find in a lot of new coaches, or like coaches that have just come from a playing career, is they often equate the philosophy to like systems they're running.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I believe my philosophy is I want to run a fast offense. My philosophy is I want to serve the ball this way. And I really appreciate how you both spoke to, it's really not about the volleyball. It's about how you are as a person, and how you communicate, and how you want the world to see you, and the effect you want to have on the people around you. So good food for thought. Great job, guys. You're doing awesome.
And John, I don't think that, like volleyball things can't be philosophies in themselves.
Yeah.
Like I think that's important to have those as well. But I think just the coaching context that Michelle and I work in, like we're getting the opportunity to work with these student athletes for generally 4 to 5 years. So there has to be a bit more of a global, long-term kind of philosophy that is there as well, not just a style of play.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed. All right, planning. We're going to kind of dip into, seasonal planning, practice planning as a whole practice, and then just individual drills. But I'm going to ask you guys to kind of put your club coaching hats on. So you're speaking to the majority of folks that might be watching this. Our reality in Nova Scotia and most provinces, our club system runs, early January to the middle of May. So broadly, what are some important areas you would consider as a club head coach when you're creating seasonal plans for your programs? And we'll start with Dan.
Well, whenever I'm planning, I kind of, first thing I do is I kind of open up the scheduling and kind of determine what are the firm things that I can't move, championships, I guess in a VNS context, the Super Series dates and things like that. And then everything else other than that is fairly flexible, or has some degree of flexibility. So then I can then kind of work backwards from, kind of the end of the season to kind of where I'm at currently, and then determine, okay, where are some kind of key moments along the way. And then it's just, I think from there, it's a fairly simple process of like, okay, like if you're trying to peak at one or multiple points in the season, then you need to prepare for that. You need to plan for that. You need to periodize for that. And I know periodization is a scary word for a lot of coaches, but it really isn't an overly complicated process. It's just planning, doing a little bit of planning, even in terms of like how tired you want your group to be, if nothing else, is really important. I think the approach of just go from day one to the end of the season is like it's pretty. I think if you get to where you're hoping for, you're going to be more lucky than anything. But yeah, that's kind of the first steps, I guess.
Great. Michelle?
I would echo what Dan said. And then I think that's one of the most important things to add on to that. we have to remember that these high school students are probably involved in multiple sports, especially within our province where their high school sport is very important. And that, volleyball in school versus volleyball for club it operates different on a different schedule, but doesn't mean they're not involved in basketball or badminton. And this is really important experiences for these student athletes. So what is the rest, recovery, and load are we asking these students for their whole schedule so that we can really balance demands? And then when we're looking at our competition load, are we heavily pushing all of our open competition at one time period so they're competing every weekend and not getting a chance to recover, is something that we want to consider. I do think that we have to make sure that we're scheduling in other things outside of just the volleyball technical stuff. Having meetings with athletes, figuring out what the athlete's intention is, what do they want to try and work on, what are their goals? Because we do find club programs or individual athletes have a mismatch of goals and objectives. Some are playing because they love playing volleyball, but they don't intend to pursue it at the next level. And then some programs have athletes on the roster where they want to make this a goal and objective for them. So making sure that the coaches understand what the athletes' intentions are, what their goals are, and how they can measure those throughout. And you can use Super Series as the different phases to kind of track, okay, phase 1, we hit Super Series 1. Did I accomplish what I wanted to accomplish? And it's a good check mark for coaches and for athletes. So I think that's a thing that they can plan in their larger seasonal plans.
Great. And, you both kind of brought some things to mind, but what are your general thoughts on just like a practice versus play ratio? And I know that's going to change versus age groups, but what are some best practices or maybe things to avoid in your experiences for practice to play? Michelle?
Yeah, I think if you overload too much competition, the athletes are never getting a chance to learn and try new things, because obviously we're competitive. When you hop onto a competition court, you don't want to try the new thing that you're not going to execute well and perform poorly. So chances are you're not developing that new thing that you need to have for down the road. So I think there's got to be a balance. However, athletes love competition. That's what drives them. They love playing that. So figuring out a way maybe to partner with another club and do exhibition where maybe it's every Sunday you compete, but there's one competition court and maybe there's a practice or learning facilitated. And maybe when they hop, they learn something on this court and then hop over to this court and can implement it into the play. And maybe that's the success criteria. I think you've got to find a way to balance. Otherwise, these athletes don't develop the technical skills or the tactical skills that they need to progress, because so much is focused on performance and compete.
Dan, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Michelle's last point is something that typically comes up in a conversation about planning, particularly in a club context. But even in our context, like if we were to step back and say, okay, like what's our training to competition ratio? And that's, the appropriate amount of each is going to fluctuate over the course of a season, of course. Yeah. But, I think the context that I see, at least, or what I see in our province most often, especially in high school, is like you're playing in a tournament every weekend, and based on what we read in LTAD, like it's for you to be competing that much, you should be training, 4 to 5 times a week, which I think would be unrealistic for most of these athletes, whether they're playing other sports or just don't have access to the gym time or whatever. I certainly understand the value of competition for what you're trying to do in the course of the season and its role in development. But I think even that in itself, like, if coaches really scrutinize what they were trying to get out of competition versus, maybe foregoing opportunities to train and then being able to evaluate the merits of each at various points in the season, I think maybe at least they're going to make more informed decisions as opposed to just doing what everyone else is doing and signing up in as many tournaments as possible. That would be my advice. Having said that, I'm not a club coach anymore, and I feel like club volleyball has changed a little bit since I coached it. So there's probably a few things that I'm not aware of, but those
No,
would be
that's
my
great.
impressions.
Great. And, I think, again, Michelle said something that sparked a thought, is that I think competition doesn't have to be, wear your uniform, or weekend tournament, either having like multiple teams in a gym at the same time. Competition can be just putting a scoreboard at practice, how you engineer your training. And then if you're having some exhibition opportunities with some other clubs and like a competition / training, then, that's fantastic. So just kind of being creative, that you don't always have to spend money to stay overnight at a hotel and travel and have like a 12-team tournament. Like the definition of competition is maybe broader than sometimes we think. So that's great. Thank you guys. I guess for both of you, like how locked into a plan are you? You spend all this time, preseason creating a plan. Have you guys changed plans like midstream, and like what would be some reasons that you might change to something else? Dan?
Well, I think any plan that doesn't have some flexibility in it is probably not going to work too well. Even I think your best plans are generally going to have some things that need to be adjusted. Some pretty obvious examples for me would be injury. So, within a team training environment, every athlete is going to be loaded, slightly differently. You're going to see this probably more exaggerated examples of this in kind of individual sports like track or swimming. But in our context, even like guys that are coming off an injury, and I think we have tools now like Vert that kind of can monitor, the load on athletes, and so you have to be very conscious of that. Athletes that are playing, more on weekends in our situation tend to need more recovery time during the week, and some athletes just need more recovery in general. There are individual differences that. So I think injuries as an extension of that idea is definitely something that you have to be able to be prepared to adjust to. Obviously, if you collect data, and I wouldn't necessarily expect a lot of coaches to collect data maybe the same way we do, where we're training these athletes almost every day or competing every day, then that data might tell you that how you are loading or training these athletes. It may not have had the desired outcomes in terms of like their fatigue levels or whatever you're looking at. So those are always reasons to change training loads. As far as like the actual content of your sessions in terms of what you're working on, well, I think there has to be a bit more of a global plan, a long-term plan, how you're kind of layering different aspects of the game throughout the course of the season. But you're also always going to have some sort of a recency effect in terms of like, man, we got killed in this part of the game and we're playing this team, and they're going to see the tape on that and they're going to try to expose the same thing. So there's always going to be some element of that incorporated into games. And maybe for the club coach that you might be playing 6 or 7 different teams in a weekend, maybe Super Series is different. Maybe you're only playing a couple teams, but in a university context, like you're preparing for 1 or 2 teams every week. So it's like you're prepping based on what you know of that opponent. They're prepping on you. You're anticipating that they're going to do this, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always going to be an element of that. So I'm not sure if that's flexibility so much as just like part of kind of the process that you're expecting. But I think along the way, I mean, very few teams are going to go through a year and say, everything went exactly the way we anticipated, so we're just going to continue to go on this plan, and we're going to beat everybody with this way of playing the game or whatever, right? So I don't think that's a very realistic situation. And even I think in a club context, most coaches are going to reflect on the last competition they had and take away a number of things that they thought they did well and things that they want to get better at. And I think as long as you have kind of like a global understanding of where you're trying to go, and feel like you can get there, just make a few modifications along the way. And if you don't check every box, that's okay. That's okay too. I think that's just part of the reality of what you're doing.
Michelle, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just, I mean, for those that have been in the gym with me, they know I have a pamphlet on me at all times. That is my, my coaching, my practice plan of some kind. And I think it's important that you plan. And I think it's also important that you have the ability to pivot. And pivot has been a huge word for me, that if something's not going the way you intended it to go, that it is okay to stop it and make adjustments. You can make adjustments on the fly. You can refer to your pamphlet practice plan during a water break to see, how can I build on this, make this better? Or you may continue because growth is happening faster or slower than desired. So you may stay in a drill or build on it because it's either working really well, or you want to adjust some parameters and be better at it. And then we also have to remember that every day we don't know what kind of athletes are going to show up in our gym, and they're student athletes. So sometimes there's the mental component of them being physically and mentally, emotionally exhausted. So what you had planned may not be the time for it. So just being able to pivot is important.
Great. And Dan, I guess you both mentioned monitoring athletes. So if I'm a club coach and asking you for advice about how can I monitor athletes in the daily training environment, but I don't have a vert system, I don't have $2,000. Could you maybe suggest one or two simple ways that a coach can be a little bit more aware or track maintenance or athlete maintenance? Dan?
Right. I think it can also just be as simple as having some sort of tool to just measure like fatigue at an internal level. So we also use like a daily survey where athletes are asked to rate a number of different things, and one of them is fatigue. And there's sometimes discrepancy between athletes, but over the course of time, like you find out kind of what the average is for each person, and then you can see if they're having a particularly tough day or not. And also just having conversations with people. I think even with all the tools that we use, like having regular chats about this and that, and trying to get a better handle of all the other external things that are happening around and outside of the volleyball court, which may impact kind of what they're capable of doing in a particular session. I think is really important. So some of those things don't cost money. It's time. And so I think just being mindful of that, understanding, and then having some ability to kind of predict certain periods of the season where it's going to get hard, whether it's academic stressors, or if a number of your athletes are playing this other sport for their school, and knowing that they have a busy time up, and then being able to accommodate for those types of things. I think you can probably avoid a lot of conflict that with more information, and information is just things that you can ask for.
Great, thank you. We're gonna pop into like an individual practice plan. You may have kind of addressed this already in talking about a seasonal plan, but what would be some things that you as a coach would be thinking about, would be going around in your head, as you sit down to plan out a practice? What are some important nuggets for each of you? Michelle, let's start with you.
Have intention has to be the first one. Know what your plan is, and stop. Don't have the drill be the first thing that you're trying to think of. Have the intention first, and then create the parameters around that. Make sure that you give your athletes some time to meet in positional groups to set some intention about what they're trying to accomplish. And that way, during water breaks, that they can hold themselves accountable to that. I think that it's important to think about load, and when do your athletes get rest, and how many times are they in the air jumping. And with club volleyball programs, you often have maybe 10 athletes. So if you're running a 2-hour practice, well, how often has that one middle blocker that's shown up to practice jumped? And so I think if you're organized with your practice, back to the load and what are the simple ways, create small parameters, make sure it's not just we're doing this for time, but we're doing 3 rounds, 10 times each. Once you do 10, you rotate, and we're going to do that 3 times so that you have a specific idea of what they're trying to accomplish. And then last thing that I would say is make sure that you allocate reflection time. You've got to know at the end of the day, did your athletes accomplish what they wanted to accomplish? And did you do that as well? So reflect and look at your plan.
Great. Dan?
Yeah, I guess I would probably just step back and maybe explain kind of what my process would look like for the week instead of just like on any specific day, because what my method usually involves is looking back at the past weekend, usually following competition, and then having the first part of that first practice back as a bit of a reflection time. And my players are pretty versed in kind of the metrics that I'm looking at, and they know what our internal standards are. They're usually part of that process in defining what those standards are. And then we can determine whether we met, our goals in those areas. And then using that as kind of a springboard for setting out the purpose and the goals for that week. And then in any particular day is like, what are we doing within that kind of theme that we have set out for ourselves for that week, that month, whatever. And then, as Michelle said, having real clear intention of what we're doing that day. What are we, we're not just going through the motions here. Some of our activities may look very similar to what we did last week, but like, why are we doing this today? And what are the exact tools or methods that we have for today, and what's going to be the expectation? So I think if we always clearly define a goal or outcome that we're seeking, and then provide a very clear idea of like how we're going to do it, and then insist and demand from each other the work and the commitment to achieving that. Generally you're kind of putting that in a very clear and concise way, and not to say that it works to success every time, but as I'm sure Michelle would agree, that it is part of the process, is going through a practice, having a lousy practice on a number of occasions, but being able to reflect on that as well, and saying, well, how can we have a better practice next time, knowing what went on today or yesterday. And so I think that's kind of the method that I use, and how a day fits in. Just, it's part of a week. Guys know what our plan is for that week. I communicate that. It's okay, this is what we're looking at doing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, or and here's kind of the corresponding workloads that you can expect. Here's the days that we got our workouts. So everyone knows what's expected each day, and they know, like, today is a short practice, but we got to go full out for 90 minutes or 75 minutes. And there might be a workout that they just finished before that, but they know that. They're not like, kind of cruising through the workout knowing that they gotta, they might have to go for a really hard practice that later that evening. They know what practice is gonna look like. I find that just being very clear with those things in most cases.
Great. I guess kind of my last, question in that planning thing. You talked a little bit about seasonal, about practice, but talking about the individual drills that we might have in a practice, whether that's 1, 2, 3, or 4 drills in whatever amount of time you have. What would you say would be some best practices or pieces of advice when planning a specific drill, if you were speaking to a club coach? Michelle?
There's so many things that you could say with this, but the one thing that I'll pick up on, because I think it's so important, is that everybody has to have a purpose when they're in a specific drill. And sometimes we could be working on serve receive, and so the middles get left out. So what is the middle's focus when that's happening? And every athlete should know what their role is and what their goals are. And then the second part to that is, what is your role and what are you watching and what are you responsible for and what are you giving feedback on? Because sometimes as coaches, when a drill's going on, we step too far back and then we're not providing the feedback that we need to, or we're too narrowly focused and we're not sure what we're providing feedback on because we're all over the place. So make sure each positional athlete has a role in their drill and make sure that you have clarity over what your role is in the drill.
Great. Dan?
I thought that was a great answer, Michelle.
Thanks, Dan.
Which means I was probably going to say the same thing. No, I'm just I guess on a slightly different angle, I think just being very deliberate about what you're covering every practice. I would venture a guess that a lot of practices look to say that's not a good thing in and of itself. But I think the purpose of what you're doing has to be very clearly defined. I think any drill that incorporates serving and passing is really important. But even within a serving and passing practice, like I would say there are a lot that I've seen that are really good, and there's probably some that aren't as good because of one or two things that I see happening in the drill itself, whether there's some element of what they're doing that's not very realistic, or it has too many people standing around doing nothing, or kind of like Michelle, right? If they're just serving, okay, and then like kind of common sense would indicate your middles should always be your best servers. Well, I think our experience would say that they're usually tied for the worst servers on the team, which is very inconsistent with the volume of serving they're having. So, and I've been guilty of this too, having guys on the team that are generally our worst servers coming up positions that serve the most in practice. So there's an implied lack of maybe purpose or clarity in what they're working on, and maybe some accountability for that as well. So I think that all those things play into it. I think that certainly in a club context, I think being able to link things together, certainly as the season goes on, trying to practice skills in combination, in other words, not practicing skills in isolation. And I'm sure most of this gets covered in coaching courses nowadays, but I mean, I can tell you, coaching at a university level, if a drill you're doing doesn't involve reception of some sort, of an actual reception skill by a player, I don't feel like there's maximum value to that drill, because if you can't pass the ball at any level, you're limiting your ability to score points in a real severe way. So I think passing is as important as at any level, and I can certainly speak to that at our level. So every drill generally has to have that first contact, and hopefully coming off some sort of serve or attack or whatever from a live player on the other side.
Great. Yeah, and like my experience with like drill planning, personally, as well as with a lot of coaches I get to work with in Nova Scotia, is as a new coach, you're always doing the drills that were done to you. Like you coached how you were coached, and there's not a mindfulness to what you're doing. It's just that's volleyball. And then you start to get really creative. So you went from being a cook who just cooked from the cookbook to being a chef who starts to like experiment with some different ingredients and start to create their own recipe, which I think there's a lot of benefits in that, and kind of you're doing something for a reason. And like a lot of cooking, there's lots of failure, lots of recipes that don't taste great, but I mean, you figure it out. You figure out what you have to adjust. And like personally, I'm just coming around to and like 5 years ago, I would have said like I created drills and thought it was great. But the downside of that is like every drill was new to the athletes, and it took them half the drill to learn to drill. So the learning of the skill, like the time was just so diminished. So, I've heard a lot of coaches, both in Nova Scotia and, internationally, just talk about like, they don't have a lot of drills. And I think it was in Ottawa at the symposium that Dan and you and I were both at. And can't remember which coach it was. It might have been Gerbic from Serbia, but it was like, how many drills do you do? He might have said like 6, 6 or 7. And his point was like, maybe the framework of the drill looked pretty similar for those 6 or 7 drills, but obviously there's an infinite amount of little tweaks you can do within drills, like how a ball is entered, how many points you need, whatever technical or tactical focus you have. But that's been a big aha moment for me, is like, something less is more. Now the athletes can just like work on the skill they're working on because they know the drill, which you guys might have figured out a long time ago. But
John, you just summarized my coaching and my cooking there, because never follow a recipe. I'm like, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and see what comes out. And let's just say my meals aren't always great.
Well, I know Dan's an expert cook, so
I
We're
wish
still
that were
waiting
true.
for the invitation.
I wish that were true, John. I can make something that tastes good to me, but that's highly subjective.
All right, fair enough. But no, appreciate your thoughts on planning, guys.
So Michelle and Dan, we're almost at the end of our time together. So we have a few final questions for you both. So I'm gonna shoot this one out to both of you. What would be 2 to 3 kind of top pieces of advice for all of our membership that's out there watching? Specifically directed at coaches. If you could give them, if you take nothing else away, take this away, what would it be? Anybody wanna jump in first?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. I think the number one thing that I can say is ask as many questions as you possibly can, get in as many people's gym as you possibly can, and keep exploring avenues to make yourself uncomfortable so that you can get better. There is no right way. So trust that you're always trying to explore something that's going to be good for your athletes, good for your program, and good for yourself. And just make sure that you always have intention.
Great, thanks. Dan?
I think just to kind of, as an offshoot of what Michelle just said, is the step after that, which is having a real clear understanding of why you do everything that you do. I find that younger coaches, and I certainly was guilty of doing this in my coaching career when I was younger as well, is just you just kind of try to just copy what other people are doing. People that, presumably you would respect or think this is a good coach, so if they're doing it, it's obviously good enough for me, without really going through a very important step of like, why are they doing this? And why is it appropriate for them? Just because this coach does it or that coach does it doesn't mean that it's appropriate for you. It doesn't even mean it's necessarily a good drill in itself. I've seen some great coaches running drills that I personally didn't think had a lot of value. And probably, at this point in my career, I could have that conversation with those coaches to really dig into the why that they're doing these things. But I think that, I have too many conversations with coaches that basically revolve around, like, I'm doing this because so-and-so, I saw so-and-so do it. And they'll preface it by saying, I got this drill from so-and-so. With the
You're giving
implied,
credit, but
with the implied, but the implication is that it's awesome because this coach is awesome, right? And I see that even in some of the coaching kind of websites now, and even like Gold Medal Squared, which should be, and I maybe I shouldn't be saying this in this kind of context, but they're the original intent is very research driven, and I think there's still a lot of stuff on their website that is that. But then even if that information's there, like, coaches will just go to that website, grab a drill, and just say, well, it's on Gold Medal Squared, therefore it's awesome, without really understanding any of the science behind why this may or may not be a good drill, right? And I guess in line with that, like, there's no shortcut for this. Like, you really have to educate yourself. That was why I did my master's degree, and got a lot more educated on concepts like motor learning, like biomechanics, like physiology, so that, when I talk about biomechanics of a jump, whatever, I have some basic understanding of the science behind that. When we talk about, how people learn or effectively learn, versus other methods, like there's some scientific understanding of that, so we can talk about random practice and have an actual understanding what that actually means. Whereas I think a lot of people don't want to put the time in. It's easier for them to just watch somebody or have someone tell them to do this without really understanding the why of it. So I think that would be probably my most important point. And then I guess my other point would be watch as much high level volleyball as you can. I'm lucky I can watch international volleyball through an app, Volumetrics app that Michelle has access to as well, and it lets us watch like the top professional players in the world, national teams, things like that. But I mean, for a club coach to go and watch, and have their athletes watch university volleyball, I can guarantee you, if I were to ask my team, and these guys are playing or practicing every day, who are the top 5 players at their position internationally, I don't think half my players could answer that question. But if I were to ask them who the starting 5 players are on the LA Lakers, probably 100% of the athletes would know that. I use this example all the time to my guys. And it's because they follow athletes in other sports more than they follow athletes in their own sport. And it's because, and I think it's less true now, but it was definitely more true when I was younger. Our sport wasn't as accessible. Now it's super accessible through the internet. But I don't think whether it's coaches or athletes being self-driven to those sources, they don't have role models in their sport. You know what I'm saying? They might look up to somebody that they're playing with or know that play the sport, but it's not through a process of like, this person who I don't know, but I really like the way they play. There's very few examples of that I find today, and that to me is a problem. And if coaches aren't watching good volleyball, and you can't expect players to be either.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I think our national teams have done a much better job of being like visible to the general public, and certainly to the volleyball community, even in the last like 5-6 years, maybe even the lead up to Rio. Like, a lot more of our athletes know who our own athletes are on our own national teams as well as international. And volleyball TV is free right now, I believe, to anybody who wants to access it. So anybody who's watching and wants to watch more volleyball, that's usually where World League and any FIVB events and high level volleyball is usually there, and you have to pay for membership, but it's free right now, so you can check that out. But yeah, again, the big takeaway I'm hearing is asking questions, seeking more information, seeking the why into what coaches are doing. And I know both of your gyms are always open door to coaches who want to come in and have a look. I know you guys do that all the time. I've been in there. John's been in there. Lots of club coaches and provincial team coaches have been invited into your gym. So thank you for that, for keeping your own environments accessible to inquiring minds. And I think even within our club communities, I think that's something that we don't do enough of. We don't go into the gym of the 15U coach if I coach 17, I don't go into the 18 and the 15U or 16U gym to see what they're doing and create that kind of lineage in between a club other than wearing the same jersey. So I think that's an opportunity that's out there for other coaches to learn from and to share information. And sometimes you can feel like you're on your own island when you're coaching. You're in a gym, on your own or with your own team, and you might never ever see anybody else other than at a competition, and it can feel pretty lonely. It can feel pretty isolating. It can make you feel not confident because you don't, it's a little intimidating to invite someone else into your gym. But opening those doors a little bit more, I think there's a lot of learning that can take place here in our province for sure. There's lots of great people out there involved in our sport. My favorite question, it's time. This is John and I's a question we have developed. It's very high level, very, very intelligent. driven. What is or are your top 1 to 2 Nova Scotia restaurants? Dan, you're first.
Well, you already know the answer, so you're
Well,
just
but
asking.
our membership doesn't know the answer.
What's number 2 then after Sushi Shige?
Shige, not Shige.
Apologies.
Cool.
Yeah, so yeah, anyone who spent any time with me and starts talking to me about food, the conversation tends to go in some fun directions. But yeah, so before the pandemic, of course, my favorite restaurant locally, Sushi Shige, just reopened at a new location on Almond Street, just off of Gottingen or Barrington. Anyways, it's a new location for them, and they are open for takeout. And it's the most authentic Japanese experience. Really, it's the only authentic, in my opinion. The chef there's trained old school way, 12 years in Japan to learn how to do these things properly. I won't try to say anything negative about the number of other places that are around there. I just would say that there's a fairly sizable gap between that place and anywhere else. In HRM, at least. I can't speak for the rest of Nova Scotia because I'd have to eat at more places to make that statement. But I guess to answer John's question, the number 2 place, I mean, the places that I would be going to before things got kind of shut down, I'd say Ronaldo's Italian place on Windsor Street is a good place. Highly recommended. And then I don't eat out that much, but Michelle would even understand. Like Daryl's, a local place there, just around the corner from where I live, and often where I take players. A lot more affordable probably than the other options, and certainly it's a very, very popular spot. Still open. They're pretty well set up for takeout. So
peanut butter burger, I think, can't go wrong.
Peanut butter burger is definitely a staple, and probably my top 2-3 choices there. So
awesome.
So those would be my 2-3.
We're gonna get
Michelle?
all those restaurants are gonna be sponsors for the next episode.
Better be.
Michelle, you're in Port Williams, right?
Yeah, so Valley Living. If you have not been to the Naked Crepe, that is a must-stop place. It doesn't matter breakfast, lunch, or dinner. They've got a menu of crepes that you could go repeatedly for 7 straight days and not have the same meal. So Naked Crepe. And then has anyone been to?
Pizza is good too.
Pizza is unbelievable. Yeah. Johnny's Burgers in Berwick.
Yes.
My goodness. So I just established that was like a place. It's a little box car on the side of the road. Yep. I've only been 2 or 3 times, but one of the best burgers by far. Yeah.
Good stuff.
Morgan Snow, friend of the show, Morgan Snow. Excited to hear you mention Berwick.
For sure.
And Michelle, could you tell us how many consecutive days in a row have you been to the Naked Crepe? What's your top number?
It depends, recruiting season. You just go one after the we're going to the Naked Crepe again. Oh, next day, Naked Crepe.
We're friends with the owners now.
Okay, but I will say this, and I don't know what this says about my personality. I get the same thing every time.
I do too.
I haven't even tasted the menu. I get the steak because I don't want to be disappointed. The breakfast crepe, bacon and egg.
Me too. It's so good.
Simple with
hollandaise sauce,
maple syrup.
Oh no. Okay, we're in a fight.
Yeah.
Awesome, amazing. I know if anybody out there is like me, I'm tired of doing dishes. Cooking every meal at home now is a struggle. So those are definitely some great restaurants for people to check out while we're in a pandemic. I know most of them, I think maybe except Naked Crepe, are open and doing takeout. So get out there and support our local restaurants, peeps. There's lots of good stuff happening. But thank you so much to Michelle Wood and Dan Ota for giving us your time today, as well as sharing your knowledge with all of us, as well as everybody who gets the time to view this, maybe two-part episode, given that we're approaching our second hour here. So thanks guys so much for being involved today.